Have you ever seen a humble spice merchant pull a legendary sword out of someone's chest and unwittingly set off a cosmic chain of events? Meet Crispin, the unassuming hero who discovers ancient cursed blades are part of a prophecy only he can fulfill. In this epic saga, Crispin's everyday skills, like blending teas and marinating sauces, collide with centuries-old destinies, immortal warriors, and corporate powers hungry for cosmic dominance. You'll witness heart-stopping confrontations, breathtaking space battles, and a final showdown where reality itself hangs in the balance. If that's not enough to spark your curiosity, wait until you see how Crispin manages to handle these dangerously magical swords, all while worrying about keeping his spice shop neat and tidy. Curious about how Crispin's simple kindness might save the galaxy? Listen to the whole story to find out, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We've got plenty more fantastic adventures in store. The holographic display flickered in the darkened museum hall, casting wavering light across ancient tapestries and dusty artifacts. The curator, a silver-haired Beltrian scholar named Veron Dulay, read aloud from a digital scroll whose edges showed signs of electronic deterioration. His voice, trembling with awe, resonated through the near-empty corridors. 3 blades, forged in the core of a dying star, each steeped in malediction's tar. One bestows might but shackles the will. Another inflicts torment that time cannot still. The last binds the soul in unbreakable chains, awaiting a hand untouched by cosmic stains. Only such purity can dispel this thrice-woven bane. Veron paused, letting the final words hang ominously in the air. These verses, attributed to the oracles of Lausanne, date back to the earliest recorded era of interstellar civilization. Legends call them the Blades of Erudan, lost for over 3 millennia. His gaze swept the hall, but it was empty except for a drifting service droid, which offered no reaction. Shaking his head, Veron closed the scroll. Even among the curious and well-educated visitors to Delta Wisp Station, few cared about cryptic prophecies older than star charts. Not far from the museum, a modest establishment struggled to attract passers-by. Crispin Bailey, a wiry human in his late 20s with perpetually tousled brown hair, was polishing the counter of his spice shop for the 6th time that morning. He sighed, glancing around to ensure every surface gleamed under the station's synthetic daylight. The sign above the door read, "Crispin's Culinary Curios," but few seemed to notice. Rows of luminous jars filled the shelves behind him, each containing an unearthly hue of powder or liquid. A shimmering violet used to sweeten beverages without sugar, a neon green marinade that could keep meat fresh for weeks, and his pride and joy, fiery SIA, a scarlet sauce rumored to momentarily boost a starship's engine efficiency if the pilot consumed it first. Nearby stood large bottles of Luna Crisp Punch, Crispin's spin on a tangy lemonade that supposedly helped alleviate headaches for long-haul freighter pilots. He ran his cloth along the countertop again, not because it was dusty, but because it gave him something to do besides brood over his lack of customers. Just as Crispin set aside the cloth, the bell over the door chimed. A lofty Lumerian, clad in a shimmering corporate suit that reflected every color of the rainbow, slid into the shop. The being's tall, elongated limbs twitched in excitement, and Crispin prepared a practiced smile. "Welcome to Crispin's Culinary Curios. What can I do for—" The Lumerian let out a frantic gasp and bowed so low that its forehead nearly brushed the floor. Are you the rumored Aldrich?" Crispin blinked, cheeks reddening in confusion. "I'm sorry, the rumored what? My name's Crispin Bailey. I'm just a spice merchant." But the visitor persisted, nearly trembling with adoration. "They speak of you across 5-star systems. He who cures the uncurable, who flavors the unflavorable, the Lumerian's eyes shone with a mixture of reverence and fear. "Some call you the fabled Aldrich, the herald of unearthly taste and cosmic renewal." Crispin offered an embarrassed grin, though inwardly he was more startled than flattered. "I'm really just a guy who likes to tinker with ingredients. Might I interest you in a sample of my latest infusion? A tea that soothes anxiety, perhaps?" Before the Lumerian could answer, a brilliant flash of light from outside the shop's window startled them both. The artificial day cycle had been steady all morning, so this sudden, searing brightness was entirely out of place. Crispin squinted through the glass and caught a glimpse of someone, blazing toward his door as though propelled by a collapsing star. He had just enough time to think, that can't be good for business. Before the metal door shrieked, the hinges blew off, and a shower of sparks rained upon him. When the chaos subsided, Crispin found himself face to face with the most arresting figure he had ever seen. Her skin was a deep lavender hue, her hair a shock of silver that defied gravity, and her eyes glowed gold like molten suns. More shocking, however, were the three gargantuan swords protruding from her chest, each bearing a distinct and dreadful energy signature. The woman locked her gaze on Crispin and spoke, her voice equal parts thunder and silk. "You, Aldrich, pull out the sword." As Crispin stood there utterly dumbfounded, he managed to choke out a weak protest. "I'm sorry, miss, but I really have no idea what you're—" Then he noticed dark violet blood seeping from around the blades, staining her black bodysuit and dripping onto his meticulously polished floor. His mild annoyance at the stains on his floor battled with his alarm at seeing someone effectively skewered, 3 times over yet still standing. The woman staggered toward the counter, each step surprisingly poised. Crispin dropped the cleaning rag and darted forward, arm outstretched. Are you hurt?" he asked, instantly regretting the foolishness of the question as soon as it left his lips. Of course she was hurt. She had 3 swords lodged in her torso. Her golden eyes narrowed as her violet hand clutched at one of the blade's hilts. She let out a pained hiss when she tried to pull it out herself, but it refused to budge, as though fused to her bones. "You must do it," she insisted, voice trembling. "Only an uncorrupted soul can remove the blades of Erudon." "Blades of Erud," Crispin repeated, recalling the half-remembered snippet of prophecy from the museum's promotional materials. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding." But the swords were gouging grooves into his polished countertop, and the woman who introduced herself with a rasping breath as Selene Areli was about to collapse onto his carefully arranged display of star anise infusions. Acting purely on instinct, Crispin reached out and gripped the hilt of the nearest sword. The instant his palm touched the ancient metal, he felt a tingling warmth spread from his fingertips, as if his entire arm had been wrapped in morning sunlight. To his surprise, the blade slid free with no more effort than drawing a chopstick from a cup. A burst of golden radiance erupted from the hilt, illuminating the entire shop. Jars rattled on shelves, and Crispin thought he heard a distant chorus of unearthly voices whispering across the threshold of reality. Selene let out a strangled gasp as the first sword clanged to the floor. She sagged against the counter, but managed to remain upright. Crispin, still holding the sword, regarded the weapon in bewilderment. Its steel was etched with glowing sigils that pulsed like a living heartbeat. It was hot to the touch, yet didn't burn him. Did I break something?" Crispin asked, alarmed that he might have just unleashed the cosmic equivalent of a catastrophic meltdown. A faint smirk traced Selene's lips despite her obvious agony. "You have no idea what you've just done." Behind Crispin, the Lumerian customer was crouched near the door's shattered frame, eyes wide with awe. Beyond the threshold, an entire crowd was gathering, drawn by the commotion. Crispin spotted onlookers from half a dozen species, some wearing maintenance uniforms, others in formal attires that suggested diplomatic positions, and uncomfortably, more than a few of them were bowing as they peered inside, whispering, "He freed one of the swords. He must be the Aldrich." Selene's trembling subsided slightly as energy coursed through her, courtesy of the blade's partial removal. "There are 2 more, she breathed, gesturing weakly at the other swords still embedded in her body. "We can't rush. The prophecies speak of the order in which they must be withdrawn. But you, Crispin Bailey, are the only one who can do it." Crispin stared at her in mute shock, then at the unearthly crowd forming outside his now ruined entrance. Outside, fluorescent station lights flickered as more onlookers appeared, some filming the scene with handheld devices, others simply pressing their faces to the twisted doorway in reverence. This is definitely not going to help me sell more fiery SIA, Crispin thought, his mind racing. The chaos escalated faster than Crispin could comprehend. Delta Wisp Station was large, a waypoint for traders, pilgrims, and corporate emissaries traveling between the Outer Rim and the Central Worlds. Word spread in minutes that a bizarre confrontation had occurred at Crispin's small shop. People started crowding around the entrance, drawn by rumors of cosmic swords and the rumored Alduric, who had succeeded in removing one of them. Crispin couldn't decide if he was more disturbed by the battered state of his door or the curious onlookers chanting half-formed prayers. Some recognized him, of course. Crispin was known around the station, albeit more for handing out free samples of his blossoming product line than for fulfilling any ancient prophecy. Many claimed he had helped them in some way. The cargo pilot whose insomnia had vanished after tasting Crispin's soothing thyme lavender mixture, or the exobiologist who discovered that fiery SIA sauce gave her the alertness she needed to observe rare nebula phenomena without sleeping for 2 days. But Crispin attributed all these successes to nothing more than a knack for experimentation and a genuine desire to help. Meanwhile, Selene Aureli had slumped into one of Crispin's bar stools, still impaled by 2 wicked-looking swords that continued to glow with menacing energy. She examined the newly freed blade Crispin held, her expression flickering between awe and relief. "You are exactly as the oracles described," she said softly. "A man untouched by the lust for power, a soul unblemished by ambition." Crispin gulped. I think you have the wrong person. I'm just an average human who likes cooking, and I'm definitely not an Alduric or anything so grand." She exhaled, exasperated yet strangely amused. "If you truly believe that, it only further proves you might be the one the prophecies mention." Her hands twitched over the hilt of the second sword, but she winced sharply at the attempt, letting the blade remain lodged in place. "The curses embedded in these swords are potent. We must be careful. Each blade has a designated sequence. Pulling them incorrectly could tear a rift through the station or through me." "That doesn't sound good," Crispin whispered. He looked at the newly freed sword again, noticing how it had begun to hum faintly, like a live wire seeking connection. It made the fine hairs on his arm stand on end. Worry warred with curiosity inside him. Outside, the gathering crowd parted, revealing a stern woman in navy blue security armor. Her hair was shaved close at the sides, giving her a keen, hawkish appearance. She was flanked by a trio of station guards, their boots clicking sharply against the metal floor panels. The onlookers scattered just enough for her to march inside. Her badge identified her as Chief Zella of station security. She surveyed the wreckage, the shattered door, the pockmarked floor, the battered state of Crispin's counter, and then her gaze landed on the 2 swords still piercing Selene's torso. Chief Zella's stoic expression cracked for a moment with horror. "What in all the starfields is going on here?" Crispin raised his free hand defensively. "Chief, I can explain, sort of. She, crashed through my door, and one of these swords was scraping up the countertop, so I just pulled it out because she asked me to." Zella's brow furrowed. "You just pulled out an artifact rumored to be dangerously cursed by cosmic energies." "Well, it did seem to be hurting her," Crispin offered, wincing. Chief Zella let out a slow breath, turning her attention to Selene. "Ma'am, do you require immediate medical attention?" she asked in that clipped, professional tone law enforcement officers tend to master. Selene's golden eyes flared. "I have been in dire need of release from these cursed blades for 3,000 years. Medical attention would be insufficient." Crispin and Chief Zella helped Selene off the stool and carefully laid her on a bench in a quieter section of the shop, away from the gawking crowd. The 2 swords in her torso still crackled with dormant but imposing energy. Crispin set aside the freed blade in a corner where it continued to hum ominously. During the lull, the Lumerian from earlier sidled up to Crispin, bowing in that awkwardly reverential manner again. "Your deed shall be spoken of across the starways, O Alderic," they whispered. "You have unleashed the first blade's might. True wonder shall follow." Crispin politely tried to wave them off. "Look, can we drop this Alderic thing? My name is Crispin Bailey. You want to buy some fiery SIA sauce? I've got a new marinade that helps with muscle strain. Maybe that's more useful to you than an archaic prophecy." But the Lumerian merely gasped, as if Crispin's words were holy scripture. "Of course. The marinade that soothes the body. a perfect metaphor for cosmic realignment. Truly, your generosity knows no bounds. The Lumerian clutched the jar as though it were a treasured relic, then bowed low again before scurrying outside. Chief Zella, hovering protectively over Selene, shook her head at Crispin. What did you do to get a cult following? I've seen a few admirers of your teas and sauces, but this is next level. She gestured to the crowd outside, which was now chanting Crispin's name in hushed tones. Some were signing up for a queue, as if waiting to witness a miraculous sword extraction personally. Absolutely nothing, Crispin insisted, dropping his voice. All I ever did was help a few folks with better flavors. Maybe I inadvertently solved a small problem or two, but it was all coincidence and good timing. Selene stirred, wincing as she tried to shift her position. Her voice was hoarse. Alderic, Crispin, listen to me. The second sword is nearly as dangerous as the first. Removing it incorrectly might kill me or trigger a catastrophic space-time fracture. The third is the worst. Its curse is older than most civilizations. She fixed Crispin with an unwavering gaze. But if we do nothing, I remain imprisoned by them. My entire reason for existing has been to see these swords undone. I beg you, trust the prophecy's path. The color drained from Crispin's face. He was barely processing the idea that curses and spells could be real, let alone that he was supposed to fix them. Can't we just get a specialized doctor or a mystic or something? Maybe there's an expert at the museum? Selene smiled faintly. Many have tried. Priests, mystics, unscrupulous warlords. All were corrupt in one way or another, driven by ambition, fear, or greed. None were pure enough to release the blades. Her tone softened. Your innocence is rare, Crispin Bailey. You want no reward from this. That's what makes you the one. Outside, the throng thickened, cameras and curious eyes pressing against the shards of the door. Chief Zella's comm device crackled with frantic voices. She stepped away to answer, leaving Crispin feeling more alone than ever. The distant whir of station ventilation made the tension in the shop almost unbearable. Finally, Crispin muttered to himself, "This is absolutely insane." Then, despite the madness of it all, he crouched next to Selene and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "I don't know anything about cosmic curses," he said softly, "but if this is causing you unbearable pain, I want to help." Her breath caught, a flicker of hope crossing her gold-flecked eyes. "Thank you." Crispin tried for a smile, though his heart thumped. "Let's just figure out how not to blow up the station in the process, okay?" Chief Zella returned, her expression grim. "We've got a situation. The news about your sword removal is spreading like solar flare wildfire. The entire docking bay is blocked by curious travelers, would-be pilgrims, and," she glanced at Selene, "potential enemies. Some might seek the swords for themselves." Selene's eyes narrowed. "Vultures," she said bitterly. "So many have longed for the power locked in these blades, never caring that it meant my eternal torment." A shadow of remembered suffering passed over her face. "Well," Crispin offered awkwardly, "we can't exactly hold a press conference telling them there's no cosmic power here, folks. Just a shopkeep with subpar sales figures." He glanced at Chief Zella. "You think you can keep them out? At least until we figure out what to do?" Zella's gaze hardened. "We'll secure a perimeter. But Crispin, be aware some of these factions are heavily armed. They're not here to buy spice rubs." She turned on her heel and marched out, barking orders at her subordinates. Exhaling, Crispin looked around his ravaged shop. Sparkling dust from the explosion still clung to the walls. Random jars had tipped over, filling the air with a potpourri of cloves, star anise, and something pungent Crispin couldn't immediately identify. He tried not to panic as he thought of future repair costs. But before he could spiral further into anxious thoughts, Selene drew his attention by reaching for his hand. "The second sword," she managed, her voice tight with pain. "We must remove it today, or the curse will consume what remains of my strength. There's a right way." A sudden commotion outside cut her off. Through the shattered doorway, Crispin saw a swirl of robes, polished boots, and crystalline staves. A tall figure in white and gold ceremonial attire stepped into the shop, followed by a retinue of devout-looking followers. Crispin recognized the insignia, The Aridon Temple Collective, a group that revered the ancient myths and studied them like strict theology. A curly-haired officiant named Patriarch Rawl, face etched with silent resolve, lowered his hood and addressed Crispin in a booming voice. The prophesied remover of swords. At last we meet. Selene emitted a low growl. Crispin tried a disarming laugh. I'm Crispin, yes, but not sure about the prophesied remover part. He shot a glance at Selene, who gave a slight shake of her head, as if warning him. The Temple Collective had a reputation for borderline fanaticism when it came to lost relics. Rawl spread his arms wide. You hold in your hands the fate of star systems. We have come to offer our assistance and guidance. These swords are not trifles for mortals to meddle with, my child. I'm hardly an expert, Crispin admitted, but from what I gather, Selene here has been suffering for centuries, maybe millennia, because no one can properly remove them. Rawl bent forward, peering at Selene. The sword-bearer, indeed. He placed a hand over his heart. The temple has yearned for the day when the bearer's affliction would be lifted. We have entire scripts dedicated to the ritual unbinding. Turning to Crispin, he added gravely, but only if performed by a soul wholly free of avarice. Crispin's cheeks went pink. That's all well and good, but if we're going to do a ritual, I'd prefer we do it quietly, maybe without an audience of thousands outside. I run a spice shop, not a cosmic amphitheater. Rawl nodded solemnly. Our temple offers a guarded sanctum where you could attempt the removal in peace. We have wards that might shield the station from potential surges of destructive power. He tapped his staff, which glowed faintly. But you must come with us now, before unscrupulous parties seize this opportunity. Selene shot Crispin a wary look. Be careful, Crispin. Their help might come with a price. Crispin felt a throbbing headache forming behind his temples as he weighed his options. From the corner of his eye, he noticed that the freed sword was flickering with renewed intensity, as though responding to the conversation about whether to attempt the next extraction. Selene's breathing was shallow, beads of sweat rolling down her lavender forehead. Time was running short if her claim about the second sword's curse was accurate. Patriarch Rawl extended a hand. Time is precious, Alderic. Let us depart to the temple's fortress. You and the bearer will be safe within our wards, and the entire station will be spared if the worst should happen. Before Crispin could answer, a shrill beep emanated from the communicator on his apron pocket. He flicked it on to see Chief Zella's face. Crispin, heads up. My officers have intercepted an armed group from Mavericks Corp. They're demanding access to your shop. Seems they want to conduct research on the swords. Her voice was tense. They're not taking no for an answer. I can only hold them back for so long. Selene grimaced. That's the corporation that once tried to harvest starship reactors using enslaved telepaths. They'll do anything to claim a new power source. They must have heard about the blades. Patriarch Rawl's expression darkened. We must leave immediately. The temple's transport is prepared to whisk you to safety. Crispin examined his fractured doorway and the swirl of confusion beyond it. The throngs were growing. He could hear shouting and at least two sets of chanting, one from the temple zealots who had marched in behind Rawl, another from who knew what cult arriving on the scene. His spice shop was quickly becoming the epicenter of a cosmic fiasco, and all Crispin wanted was to help Selene fix his door. He looked at the anxious woman on the bench, at the swords twisting in her chest, and realized there was no easy path. Then, with trembling resolve, he said, Okay, we'll come with you, but if anything goes sideways, if I sense that you're trying to use these swords for your own gain, I'm leaving. My priority is to help Selene, not to feed anyone's thirst for power. A flicker of respect crossed the patriarch's face. Understood. I will arrange safe passage through the crowd. We must hurry. They helped Selene to her feet. She tried to maintain her regal bearing, but Crispin could tell she was hurting. He steadied her as they moved toward the exit, the freed sword slung over his back in a makeshift strap. It pulsed against him, sending faint vibrations of energy along his spine. Crispin grimaced at the bizarre sensation. As they reached the threshold, Crispin turned to glance at his half-ruined shop. Jars of glowing spices lay scattered, and a battered sign that read Daily Specials was cracked in two. The once cozy space now looked like a battleground. With a pang of guilt, He snatched a small tin of healing tea leaves from a shelf, thinking Selene or someone else might need them soon. I'll come back, he told himself, though he didn't truly know what awaited him beyond this moment. Outside, Chief Zella and her officers had formed a tight cordon, standing firm against a press of furious corporate agents, enthralled pilgrims, and curious onlookers. When Crispin emerged, flanked by the temple contingent, gasps rippled through the crowd. Some started bowing again, and Crispin felt his cheeks burn in mortification. A few brandished signs, "Save the Bearer," "Alderic," "Chosen of the Stars," and so forth. He tried his best to ignore the clamoring. Chief Zella barked an order, and her squad parted the throng to make a path. Crispin offered the chief a tense nod of gratitude as the temple group hustled him and Selene toward a waiting transport shuttle. As Crispin approached the sleek vessel, he couldn't help but shudder at the shrill cries behind him. Voices rose in a haunting cacophony, some praising him, some cursing him. The storm had only begun. The temple's transport shuttle surged away from the chaotic crowds, gliding through pressurized tunnels that connected various modules of Delta Wisp Station. Crispin held Selene's hand firmly, hoping to steady her as they bounced lightly in the craft's artificial gravity. She was pale, her violet skin a sickly shade of lavender, and each breath seemed to cost her an enormous effort. The two remaining swords, each radiating a malignant aura, were held in check only by Selene's formidable will, and perhaps Crispin's own unrecognized influence. Across from them sat Patriarch Rawl, silent and watchful, while several of his temple followers recited prayers under their breath. Their crisp white robes bore intricate starburst designs in gold thread, and Crispin noticed the faint hum of protective wards etched into their clothing. When the shuttle passed through the final bay lock, Crispin caught a glimpse of distant stars through a viewport. Myriad starships, everything from private vessels to looming dreadnoughts, circled the station like hungry hawks, no doubt drawn by the rumor of cosmic swords and the so-called Alderic. A leaden weight settled in Crispin's stomach. He wanted no part of any prophecy, yet it pursued him with relentless fervor. Soon the shuttle arrived at Temple Aruden, an austere complex of vaults and corridors that occupied one of the station's older sectors. Originally designed as a cargo module before the Temple Collective claimed it, it now boasted vaulted ceilings, sculptures depicting star-forged relics, and alcoves set aside for reverent study. Crispin swallowed as they crossed a threshold where flickering runes glowed red, scanning them for dark influences. Or so one acolyte explained. No alarms rang. Crispin half expected something to beep in objection to the swords protruding from Selene's body, but the runes seemed designed not to reject her presence, but to keep out other threats. He wondered if the wards were advanced technology or real sorcery, but then recalled how he'd just pulled a cursed sword out of a woman's chest that morning. His perspective on what was real had drastically shifted. Patriarch Rawl guided them into a dimly lit chamber, smelling of sandalwood and old books. "This is our sanctum of unbinding," he announced, indicating a circular room circumscribed by large crystals jutting from the floor. The crystals form a lattice that can contain reality ripples, should they occur. "And are they likely to occur?" Crispin asked, his anxiety spiking. Selene's grip tightened on his forearm as if acknowledging the danger. "Quite," Rawl replied soberly. "Each blade is said to hold enough energy to bend star fields. If the curses are released improperly, the backlash could—" He trailed off, letting Crispin's imagination fill the gap. Selene let out a ragged breath as a minor spasm racked her body. "We don't have much time. The second blade is the crux of agonies, said to feed on the bearer's pain." She winced, bracing her free hand against the nearest crystal. "I've lived with its torment for so long that I fear it might try to latch onto anyone who removes it." Crispin's eyes darted from Selene to Rawl. "Latch on? To me?" Rawl raised a solemn hand. "If you are as pure of heart as the prophecy claims, you should withstand the blade's hunger. But be warned, Crispin Bailey, if there is any hidden darkness in you, the sword may twist it." Shaken, Crispin slipped a hand into his apron pocket, feeling the comforting shape of the small tin of tea leaves he had brought along. He recalled the day he discovered those leaves, how they seemed to soothe the rawest anxieties. Did he really believe he was free of darkness? He was just a guy who loved to help people, but was that enough to fend off an ancient curse? Doubt curled in his stomach. As Selene sank to her knees, Crispin hurried to support her. The sanctum of unbinding felt oppressive, the air thick and tinged with static electricity. Her eyes fluttered closed, and Crispin realized that if they didn't act quickly, her remaining strength might not hold out. With sudden clarity, he blurted, "All right, we should remove this second sword now. Show me what to do." Patriarch Rawl gave a swift series of hand gestures to his acolytes, who then formed a ring around the room, each holding a thin crystal rod. They began a low, droning chant. Selene nodded in affirmation. "Yes, do it carefully," she whispered, her voice ragged. Her trembling hand lightly touched the second sword's hilt. In a hush, she explained, "Grasp it and pull steadily. Don't hesitate, and above all, don't let go until it's out." Heart pounding, Crispin positioned himself behind Selene, breath coming in shallow bursts. The hilt of the sword looked strange, like blackened obsidian etched with faint lines of red. A faint buzzing in Crispin's ears grew louder as he reached for the weapon. His mind spun with questions. What if I fail? What if it curses me? What if I tear a hole in space-time and kill everyone in here? Yet something about Selene's presence and the memory of her centuries-long suffering emboldened him. He refused to let fear dominate him when it came to helping someone in pain. He closed his hand around the sword. At once, a surge of cold, piercing agony shot through his fingers, up his arm and into his chest. Crispin's vision swam with flickers of long-buried insecurities. Moments he had felt useless, the sting of a lonely childhood, the memory of humiliating failures. It was as if the sword sought to devour every regret and magnify it. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay focused on Selene. This wasn't about his pain. It was about freeing her. "Pull," Selene rasped. "Don't let it trick you." Summoning a courage he didn't realize he possessed, Crispin yanked. The sword resisted. His thoughts screamed, images swirling. The time his adoptive parents told him he was too soft. The jeers of older kids who mocked his fascination with spices instead of zero-G sports. The energy coiled around his heart, threatening to break him. He nearly let go, but then he saw Selene slump forward, teeth clenched, tears escaping the corners of her eyes. Something sparked in Crispin's soul. No one should suffer like this, and he pressed on. With a final wrench, the blade tore free. A shockwave of crimson light rocked the sanctum, sending the acolytes staggering. One by one, the crystal rods they held flared, absorbing most of the stray energy. Crispin staggered back, clutching the sword, which seemed to writhe in his grip like a living serpent. In a moment of pure instinct, he recalled what Selene had said about not letting go, so he gripped it tighter, refusing to surrender to the soul-numbing chill coursing through his veins. Across the chamber, Patriarch Rawl and the acolytes redoubled their chants. The ring of crystals that formed the chamber's boundary crackled with arcs of crimson lightning, containing the swirling energy. Selene's eyes snapped open. A ragged moan escaped her lips as dark fluid trickled from her wounds. Then, in a rush of black smoke, the sword's malignant aura shrank, drawn toward Crispin's trembling form. "Focus, Crispin Bailey," Rawl commanded. "Channel that energy into the crystals. Do not let it consume you." Gasping for air, Crispin struggled to think. He pictured the one place he felt at peace, behind the counter of his shop, stirring tea leaves in a small pot, letting fragrant steam wash over him. He closed his eyes and allowed that memory to fill him, steady him, reminding him of who he was. A chef, a helper, someone who found solace in quiet acts of kindness. The sword's fury shrieked in his mind, but Crispin stayed centered. Slowly, agonizingly, he felt the dreadful cold recede, siphoned through the chanting acolytes into the floor crystals. The second sword at last went limp in his hand, its obsidian glow fading to dull gray. When the swirling energies finally subsided, Crispin collapsed to his knees, sword clattering to the ground. He felt lightheaded, heart hammering like he'd just run a marathon. Selene let out a raw, wavering sob, pressing a hand to the empty space on her chest where the second sword had been. 2 down, 1 to go. Patriarch Rawl gave a soft command to the acolytes, and they ceased their chant. They hurried forward with cloths and bandages steeped in some herbal concoction, pressing them to Selene's wounds. Crispin, in a daze, tried to help, but his hands shook so badly that a young acolyte gently took the bandages from him. Selene's golden eyes found Crispin's. In them, he read profound relief, and something like gratitude he couldn't fully quantify. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I can't remember the last time the weight of that blade was off me." Staring at his trembling hands, Crispin tried to form words. I how do I feel both freezing and boiling hot?" he mumbled. Indeed, beads of sweat cooled on his forehead, yet his chest felt cold as space. The second sword lay inert on the tile floor, stripped of its malignant energies for the moment. He couldn't quite believe he was still alive. Patriarch Rawl placed a steady hand on Crispin's shoulder. "You stood firm against the crux of agonies. The mere fact you are coherent right now testifies to your purity of spirit." Crispin managed a shaky laugh. Purity or just sheer stubbornness, maybe. He tried to rise but nearly toppled. Two acolytes rushed to support him, guiding him to a nearby bench. Outside the sanctum's sealed doors, Crispin could hear the muffled sound of others in the temple halls. Perhaps more devotees or station security or curiosity seekers demanding updates. The swirl of distant voices reminded him that the entire station was on edge. Selene rested, eyes half-lidded, while Rawl oversaw the process of storing the second sword in a protective cylinder that glowed faintly. The blackened blade looked smaller, almost pitiful, now that its cursed essence was siphoned. Crispin's gaze shifted to Selene. Freed from two swords, she appeared more regal despite her exhaustion. The lavender tint of her skin had brightened slightly, and her posture, though slumped, no longer screamed agony. "Your suffering, is it less now?" Crispin ventured. Her lashes fluttered. "Far less. For centuries I've endured stabbing torment that never dulled. Now it's as if a vice around my soul finally loosened." She swallowed hard. "But the third sword remains. The worst one." Before Crispin could ask about the final blade, Rawl stepped forward, his face etched with concern. "We must be wary. Even sealed, the second sword's curse is only dormant. The final blade is rumored to warp reality itself. Removing it within the station might be catastrophic." Selene nodded weakly. "He's right. The first blade you pulled was the blade of raging flame. Raw, powerful, but straightforward in its release. The second was the crux of agonies, subtler and more insidious. The third is known in old texts as the marrow of dominion. It takes control of a realm, binds it, shapes it to the bearer's will. The risk is unimaginable." A thick silence settled on the chamber. Crispin's gaze flicked from the inert second sword in the cylinder to the final blade still in Selene's body. Even from a distance, he could feel it pulsating with a low thrum of power, like the beat of some monstrous heart. He shuddered, remembering how easily the second sword had nearly overwhelmed him. "How do we remove it safely?" he asked, bracing for the worst. Rawl exhaled. "Safely? There might be no such thing. But there is a place beyond station borders where the lattice of reality is thinner, where the backlash could be channeled harmlessly. A dead star cluster known as the Fallen Spiral. If we had enough time, we could travel there. But we risk other factions intercepting us." Selene attempted to straighten up. "I'll do what it takes, even if it means leaving the station. On anything to prevent unnecessary harm." Crispin swallowed. Leaving the station? He thought about his humble shop, his few loyal customers, the life he'd built. Yet a single glance at Selene's determined but pained face told him there was no alternative. This final blade needed to go, somewhere far from unsuspecting bystanders, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The acolytes eased Selene onto a medical hover stretcher, preparing her for transport. Crispin was offered a moment to recoup in an adjacent meditation chamber, but the hushed chanting from the sanctum and the looming weight of decisions kept his mind spinning. By the time he sank onto a cushion in the quiet room, every muscle in his body trembled with fatigue. Just then, Chief Zella's voice crackled through the communicator, clipped to his apron. Crispin, do you copy? He tapped the device. I'm here, he said, voice unsteady. We've got a standoff in the temple corridor, she said flatly. Maverick's Corp's paramilitary group tried to push through the wards. The temple's defenders haven't let them pass. I'm stuck playing mediator. Crispin rubbed his eyes. Patriarch Rawl says we're planning to leave the station to remove the final sword safely. Leave? Zella echoed, and Crispin could almost hear her eyebrows shooting up. Do you realize how many warships, cultists, and corporate mercenaries are lurking outside? Getting off station might be trickier than you think. A heavy sigh slipped from Crispin's lips. Then we need your help, Chief. I'm no hero, but people are depending on us to get Selene out of here. If we do this on station, we might tear the place to shreds. Quiet static. Then Zella's brusque tone returned. All right, I'll coordinate with station officials, see if I can get you a secure corridor to a dock. But Crispin, be ready for anything. And if you can talk that patriarch into cooperating with my officers, it'd help. Crispin ended the call and stood, his legs stiff. The reality of the situation pressed in. He was about to accompany an ancient sword-bearer who'd been skewered for centuries to a dead star cluster with a powerful temple faction at their side, all while half the galaxy's power brokers tried to intercept them. It sounded like something ripped out of the kind of myths he used to skip reading in favor of cooking experiments. Drawing in a slow breath, he left the meditation chamber and headed back to the sanctum. He found Rawl directing his acolytes to pack specialized equipment, portable wards, protective relics, ration containers shaped like small orbs. Selene lay on the hover stretcher, eyes shut in brief respite. The final sword in her chest stood out starkly, the faint glow at its hilt reminiscent of a heartbeat. Even from across the room, Crispin sensed the blade's malevolent vigilance. Chief Zella just told me the corridors aren't safe, Crispin told the Patriarch. We'll have to coordinate carefully if we want to reach a docking bay. Rawl nodded gravely. Our temple guard can provide escorts. The wards here will not last indefinitely if Maverick's Corp attempts a larger assault. We should move soon. He paused, then his stern gaze softened slightly. My son, you have done more than any of us could have hoped. Are you certain you want to continue? If you remain behind, we could... Crispin shook his head. I appreciate the thought, but I can't just leave Selene to do this alone. It was my hands that freed the first two blades. I can't abandon her now, especially when removing the final sword is the most dangerous part. Rawl tilted his head in respect, making an intricate gesture across his robes. Then may the blessings of every star be upon you. We depart as soon as we can secure the route. Crispin walked to Selene's side, resting a hand on her arm. She cracked her eyes open, offering him a fragile smile. We're leaving soon? She asked, voice quivering with lingering pain. Yes, Crispin murmured. We'll get you to safety, remove that sword properly, and then maybe, just maybe, we can all go back to living normal lives. But somewhere deep within, Crispin suspected that nothing would ever be normal again. Escorted by temple guards in ceremonial armor, Crispin and Selene were rushed through dimly lit corridors that twisted like a labyrinth. The temple had intricately designed hallways, each with its own icons or runic patterns. At times, Crispin almost lost his bearings, focusing too much on the rhythmic hum of Selene's hover stretcher to track where they were going. Patriarch Rawl led the way, staff held high to cast a soft glow that pushed back the shadows. At the far end of a wide passage, Crispin could see a cluster of station security officers standing in tense formation, their weapons trained not on the temple group, but on a row of heavily armed Maverick's Corp mercenaries who wore sleek black exosuits. Their leader, a tall figure with sharp features that Crispin vaguely recognized as Director Klen, engaged in a low-voiced argument with Chief Zella. Klen's suit reflected ambient light in unnerving ways, suggesting advanced shielding tech. Crispin swallowed hard, dread swirling in his gut. The moment Crispin and Rawl's retinue appeared, the mercenaries tensed, rifles lifting. The temple guards shifted formation around Crispin and Selene, crystal-tipped spear buzzing with the protective energy. Chief Zella turned, relief flickering across her normally stoic features. There you are. I tried to tell Mavericks we have a plan in place, but they insist on studying the swords themselves. Clem stepped forward, dark eyes flicking to Selene's stretched-out form. Your fiasco is causing an interstellar incident, Mr. Bailey. Our scanners show unimaginable levels of quantum distortion from those swords. For the station's safety, we must confiscate them and keep the bearer under corporate care. Selene coughed, clearly exhausted. Crispin stiffened protectively. She's a person, not a lab specimen, and you're not confiscating anything. We're leaving the station to remove the threat. That's precisely why Mavericks can't allow you to depart, Clem countered, voice icy. Once you're beyond station borders, no one can regulate how you utilize that power. Mavericks regulation? Crispin echoed, dumbfounded. It's not your place to regulate. You exploit everything you touch. I've read the news about your so-called research colonies. A rare spark of anger flared in Crispin's usually gentle demeanor. Clem's lips curled. Don't be naive. If you truly believe releasing that final sword won't lead to catastrophic repercussions, you're gambling with countless lives. Patriarch Rawl planted his staff firmly on the floor. We will not barter with greed. Stand aside. Chief Zella lowered her rifle, stepping between the two opposing groups. Director Clem, you know station protocols grant freedom of movement unless a clear criminal act is in progress. Crispin here is not under arrest. Neither is Selene. Unless you want a legal war with half the star systems who recognize them, you need to stand down. Clem's expression hardened. For several tense seconds, Crispin was sure a firefight would erupt. A trickle of sweat slid down his temple. Then, one of the Mavericks mercenaries nudged Clem, whispering an urgent report. Clem pressed his lips into a thin line before letting out a frustrated breath. Fine, but only because a violent standoff doesn't serve our goals, Clem said. We'll stand down. However, our ships will track you if you leave the station. Mavericks will not tolerate the release of a galactic-level threat without safeguards. Chief Zella clicked her tongue. Tracking is better than open warfare. She beckoned Crispin forward, ignoring Clem's glare. Her eyes softened as she addressed him quietly. I'll help you get a ship. I just hope you know what you're doing, Crispin. He exhaled, fatigue and apprehension washing over him. So do I, he replied. Believe me, I'm making this up as I go. With that, they began their cautious truce, the temple guard escorting Crispin and Selene, Chief Zella's security detachment ensuring the quarters stayed conflict-free, and the Mavericks mercenaries prowling nearby, their weapons never fully lowered. Minutes later, they arrived at a private docking bay used primarily for religious or diplomatic vessels. Sleek columns lined the walls, and overhead lights bathed the area in a pale glow. Among the few ships present was the Dawnstalker, a mid-sized craft belonging to the temple. It boasted an elongated hull studded with crystal arrays, likely some form of integrated barrier or advanced scanning technology. Temple acolytes had already swarmed around the ramp, ferrying crates of supplies on board. Chief Zella paused at the foot of the gangway, her posture taut. Okay, Crispin, this is as far as I can go. I still have a station to protect. She glanced at Selene, who dozed fitfully on the hover stretcher. Take care of her, she added softly, surprising Crispin with her gentle concern. And watch your back out there. Mavericks might follow you, or some other lunatic might try to board your ship mid-flight. I will, Crispin promised. He hesitated, then impulsively handed the chief a small pouch of tea leaves from his apron. To help with headaches, please don't let the station turn into a war zone in my absence. She accepted the pouch, a rare smile flickering across her lips. I'll do my best, Crispin Bailey. The temple guards wheeled Selene up the ramp while Crispin and Patriarch Rawl followed. A hush fell as they entered the vessel. Inside, corridors gleamed with polished metal inlays and symbols that Crispin guessed were some sacred geometry. The smell of incense clung to the air. A discreet hum of power coursed through the ship's frame. Once Selene was secured in a modest infirmary chamber, where two robed healers began hooking her up to intravenous lines laced with mild analgesics, Patriarch Rawl escorted Crispin to the bridge. It was a compact command center, dominated by a hemispherical console ringed with crystalline interfaces. A tall, willowy figure with short silver hair stood at the helm, performing final pre-flight checks. Patriarch Rawl cleared his throat. Crispin Bailey, meet Captain Thena Saran. She is sworn to carry out our mission, no matter the odds. Thena saluted Crispin with a slight tilt of her head. I've been briefed on the situation, she said in a calm, clear voice. We'll head out at low burn to avoid immediate detection, then make a short jump to the nearest conduit lane. Our target? The fallen spiral, correct? Crispin swallowed a surge of nerves. That's what Rawl says. Someplace where the final sword's power can be safely released. Safely is a relative term, Rawl muttered, eyeing Crispin. We must prepare for the worst. The fallen spiral is a nexus of gravitational anomalies, remnants of a star cluster that died eons ago. Rumor holds the boundaries of reality are weaker there. If the sword unleashes a shockwave, the emptiness might absorb it. Thena nodded briskly and keyed in coordinates. Hold on tight then. We'll depart as soon as external traffic control gives us clearance. Her gaze turned sympathetic. I hear you've done enough saving the day for one lifetime, Crispin. Let's hope this final leg won't push your luck too far. Crispin tried to smile but couldn't muster it. Anxiety gnawed at his insides. Half the galaxy seemed to either revere him or want to dissect him. He was about to travel to a desolate star graveyard with an ancient warrior to remove a reality-warping sword, and all he could really think about was whether the people back at Delta Wisp Station were going to be safe from corporate exploitation, or whether he'd ever see his humble spice shop again. Patriarch Rawl placed a steadying hand on Crispin's shoulder. Your soul has proven resilient. You thwarted the crux of agonies, something no one else in recorded history has managed without succumbing to madness. I was close, Crispin admitted quietly. Madness was knocking at my door, but Selene's suffering was worse. I just did what I had to do. Rawl pressed his lips together, nodding in understanding. That kind of empathy is precisely why we believe in you, Crispin Bailey. But the final sword will challenge you in ways the others did not. Steeling yourself with compassion may not be enough. It feeds on dominion, on the drive to control. Crispin's pulse fluttered. Control. He'd never craved control. He liked helping, not dominating. Perhaps that was his advantage, or so he hoped. Casting one last glance at the star charts on Thena's console, Crispin steeled himself for departure. Time to see this journey through, whether or not I'm ready. The Dawnstalker detached smoothly from Delta Wisp Station, its engines humming with an otherworldly resonance, courtesy of the temple's crystalline propulsion systems. Crispin stood behind Captain Thena on the bridge, watching the station's lights dwindle in the forward screens. Despite all the tension he'd faced in recent days, mad prophecies, cosmic swords, corporate threats, a pang of nostalgia tugged at him. Would he ever see his cramped spice shop again, where he used to whisk his experimental teas in blissful ignorance? He took a step back, letting Thena and her co-pilot manage the tricky departure. Patriarch Rawl, robes rustling, joined him at the observation window. We'll need to engage a low-profile jump into slip space, Rawl explained quietly. Mavericks Corp is likely tailing us with advanced scanners. They may not risk an open attack, but they'll track us. Crispin nodded absently, gaze flicking to a smaller monitor that displayed vital readings from the infirmary. Selene was stable for the moment, but her stress levels were elevated. The final sword's malignant signature pulsed in the readout like a drumbeat. Crispin could almost sense its presence in his own pulse, no matter how far he roamed from the infirmary. Captain Thena, he said, voice hushed. Once we're clear, how long until we reach this fallen spiral? Thena straightened at the helm, her silver hair catching the overhead lights. We'll make a partial slip space jump to Waypoint Echo in about 4 hours. From there, a second jump will drop us at the fringe of the fallen spiral. Total travel time, about 9 standard hours, if all goes well. She turned, expression calm but serious. If Mavericks intercepts us, or if we run into any other opportunists, it may take longer. A quiet beep sounded at the console and Thena pressed a key. Navigator, ready slipspace aperture, she commanded. The overhead screens flickered, revealing a swirl of deep blues and purples as the Dawnstalker slipped into an extra-dimensional corridor. Delta Wisp Station vanished from sight. Patriarch Rawl exhaled, as if some enormous tension had just lifted from his shoulders. We're committed now. The next time we see that station, We'll either be rid of the final sword, or everything will have gone terribly wrong. He gestured for Crispin to accompany him out of the bridge. Come, there's someone who wishes to speak with you. A short walk down the softly lit corridor brought them to the Templar Council chamber, a semicircular room with windows offering a view of prismatic slip-space currents. Within, a cluster of robed figures waited, each bearing a badge denoting their station in the temple hierarchy. Unlike the acolytes, these were council elders, their garments lined with silver filaments. They all turned toward Crispin with measured respect. One elder, a wiry woman with weathered skin, stepped forward. She introduced herself as Elder Maury. Crispin Bailey, she began in a voice that quavered with age, yet resonated with authority. We have heard how you freed the first two blades of Erudon from the bearer. Few in our history have stood against curses older than the stars themselves. Crispin shifted uncomfortably, recalling how each removal had nearly fried his brain, and how his so-called innocence felt more like cluelessness. I did what I could, he said modestly. Mari bowed her head. You do yourself a disservice. The temple has curated legends of an Alderic, a soul free from ambition's stain, who alone could unbind these relics. Some of us doubted that prophecy. We have seen too many false saviors. She paused, piercing eyes studying Crispin's features. You have proven us wrong. A hush fell as another elder stepped forward, a tall figure named Elder Colaro with a braided white beard. He carried a slender staff topped by a shard of translucent crystal that refracted slip-space colors into rainbow glimmers. We gathered not just to praise you, he said gravely, but to offer a final warning. The last blade, the marrow of dominion, tests not just pain or raw power. It tests desire. Should you harbor even a seed of greed or lust for control, it will latch onto it, magnifying it 1,000-fold. We fear it will tempt you, Crispin Bailey. Crispin swallowed. Tempt me? How? Elder Maury exchanged a glance with Colaro before answering. It may show you visions of grandeur, of controlling the cosmos, of shaping matter and life to your every whim. It lures with the promise of absolute benevolence, persuading you that you could reshape reality for the good of all. Her brow furrowed. But absolute power corrupts, no matter how pure one starts. Looking down at his hands, Crispin tried to imagine what it would feel like to command the cosmos. It sounded terrifying. He thought about the countless times he'd made mistakes with simpler pursuits, like misjudging the amount of chili oil in a sauce. I'm not interested in ruling anything, he admitted softly. I just want to help Selene and go back to my normal life if that's still possible. A faint, benevolent smile touched Maury's lips. That is precisely why you may succeed, but you must be on guard. The sword's illusions might be more insidious than any pain you've felt. Patriarch Rahl nodded solemnly. We can offer you protective incantations, though their effectiveness is uncertain. The marrow of dominion predates our oldest spells. From within his robe, Colaro withdrew a small medallion wrought from a shimmering metal Crispin didn't recognize. Wear this, the elder said, pressing it into Crispin's palm. It is called the vessel's shield, forged from the remains of a star that was once used to seal away lesser curses. It may give you a buffer against the sword's illusions, but do not trust it blindly. Crispin closed his fingers around the medallion, feeling a subtle warmth that reminded him of dawn sunlight. Thank you, he said, voice low. If there's a chance it'll help me stay, then I'm grateful. A subdued chime from the corridor's speakers interrupted them. Attention, slip space jump complete in 5 minutes, announced Captain Thena over the intercom. Brace for reversion to normal space. Next jump to the fallen spiral in approximately 4 hours. Elder Maury raised her staff. We will retire to the meditative cells to strengthen our wards. Crispin, we ask that you visit Selene. She may awaken soon, and it could bring her comfort to see you before we exit slipspace. Crispin nodded, bowing politely to the council elders. Their presence unnerved him. They wielded knowledge that felt beyond his comprehension, but at least they treated him with kindness, rather than the fanatical worship or corporate greed he'd encountered so often lately. Despite the weight of their warnings, Crispin sensed genuine concern in them, as though they recognized the sword's final unbinding was as treacherous for them as it was for him. Stepping out into the corridor, Crispin found the path to the infirmary by memory. The walls glowed with the ship's subdued lighting, an atmosphere that seemed designed to calm frayed nerves. He could only hope it would calm his too. The infirmary was a small, well-organized space with 3 patient berths, each equipped with a sleek medical console. Selene lay in the center berth, intravenous lines feeding her body a mild sedation. At Crispin's entrance, one of the temple healers approached, pressing her palms together in a sign of respect. She's resting. The second sword's removal caused significant shock to her system, but she's stable. Crispin nodded and moved quietly to Selene's side. She still had that regal bearing, even unconscious, her lavender features framed by disheveled silver hair. The final sword, a dark, sinuous blade half buried in her torso, emanated a constant, low-grade hum. Crispin's skin prickled the closer he stood to it. A rustle of sheets signaled Selene stirring. Her eyes flicked open, glowing gold in the infirmary's soft light. She looked at Crispin as if seeing a dear friend after many lonely nights. "Hey," she managed, voice raspy. "How are you feeling?" Crispin asked softly, taking a seat on a nearby stool. She let out a breath. "Tired, relieved not to have the second sword draining me, and uneasy about the last one." She glanced down at her chest where the final blade nestled. "It's different. It's been quiet for so many centuries, but ever since you pulled the other 2 swords, it's been awake." Crispin chewed his lip, recalling the temple elders' warnings. "They said it's the marrow of dominion. It might tempt me when I remove it." Selene managed a faint smile. "If you knew how many would-be conquerors tried to take these blades from me, the moment they sensed the final sword, they lost all sense of reason, enthralled by visions of empire building or universal rulership." Her gaze softened. "But you're so selfless. I can't imagine you succumbing." He gave a shaky laugh. "I'm not selfless, believe me. I just like quiet things, like brewing tea and mixing spices. This prophecy stuff is way out of my league." Despite the flippant tone, Crispin felt real dread curling in his gut. If this sword could truly bend reality, who was to say he wouldn't at least consider using it for good? A stray fantasy flitted across his mind, a galaxy without suffering, where diseases vanished and hunger was unknown. The notion was intoxicating, and exactly the kind of good intention that might spiral out of control. Selene seemed to sense his turmoil. Gently, she reached out and touched his hand. "Remember who you are, Crispin Bailey. You help people because you care, not because you hunger for power. If the blade tries to seduce you, hold on to that truth." Her words felt like the warmth of a fire on a cold night. Crispin curled his fingers around her hand. "I'll do my best." They rested in silence for a moment, comforted by the presence of each other. Outside the infirmary, Crispin heard the distant thrum of the ship's engines and the occasional shouts of acolytes rushing about. Everyone was preparing for the next slip-space jump to that desolate star cluster, where Crispin would face the sword's final challenge. Suddenly, an alert chimed from the overhead speaker. "Exiting slipspace. All hands brace for normal space reversion." The lights flickered, and the subtle, otherworldly swirl of colors vanished from the view screen near the infirmary entrance. In their place, Crispin spotted the black void of normal space and the distant glint of several vessels. His heart lurched. Mavericks, he wondered, or some other unscrupulous faction lying in wait, hoping to steal the final blade. Whatever it was, Crispin had a sinking feeling that the next few hours would define not just his fate, but Selene's, and perhaps the galaxy's. The Dawnstalker emerged into a sector illuminated by a weary sun that cast elongated shadows across the emptiness. Captain Thena's voice crackled over the intercom, taut with urgency. "Multiple vessels on sensors. Looks like Mavericks Corps has arrived ahead of us. 2 cruisers and a swarm of smaller escorts. They're holding position, but have locked scanning arrays on us." Crispin felt Selene's grip tighten on his hand. He glanced at her, brow furrowed. "They're not attacking yet, right?" "Not yet," Thena replied, an edge in her tone. "We're set to jump again in under an hour, but we need time to reorient slipspace coordinates. They may not give us that time." Across the infirmary, the temple healer shut off the sedation drip, allowing Selene to gather enough strength to stand. She winced but pressed her palm against Crispin's shoulder for balance. I should be in the main chamber. If they force a confrontation, I need to be ready. Together, they made their way to the command deck, where Rawl and a few robed navigators crowded around a circular console. Kalaro and Maori stood nearby, their faces tense. On the central screen, Crispin saw the indicated Maverick ships, a small blockade capable of intercepting almost any route. A flicker of insight told him that no matter how advanced the Temple's slipspace engines were, if Mavericks decided to open fire, escaping unscathed would be difficult. Patriarch Rawl turned towards Selene, bowing respectfully. Lady Aurelie, are you well enough to stand? She exhaled. Well enough to fight if it comes to that. Her gaze drifted to Crispin. But I'd rather we find a way out without killing anyone. That's not how I want my freedom to begin. Crispin felt a rush of gratitude. The last thing he wanted was a pitched battle. He stepped forward, turning to Thena. Is there any chance we can... A sudden burst of static interrupted him, followed by a crackling voice overhead. Temple vessel, this is Director Klen of Mavericks Corp. Stand down and surrender your cargo, the sword bearer and the relics you carry, or face immediate interdiction. A hush fell. Crispin traded looks with Rawl, whose expression darkened. So much for stalling, the Patriarch murmured. Selene straightened, ignoring the pain in her chest. She gestured for Crispin to activate the comlink. When the channel opened, her voice emerged smooth and resolute. Director Klen, I am not your cargo. I've endured captivity in various forms for millennia, and I will not abide another second of it. You misunderstand, Lady Aurelie, Klen replied coolly. I hold no personal vendetta. Our interest is purely scientific and altruistic, if you'll believe it. The power in those swords could revolutionize interstellar technology, end resource shortages, expand humanity's reach among the stars. Or incinerate them, Crispin cut in, anger pricking at his composure. What you call altruistic research is just corporate exploitation. Don't act like you care about the galaxy's well-being. Silence crackled, then Klen's voice returned, ice in every word. You've had your chance. Our cruisers will move in. Any attempt to jump away will be met with disabling fire. Captain Thena muttered a curse. Rawl placed a hand on Crispin's shoulder, guiding him away from the console. We can't outgun them head-on. Our best chance is to hold them at bay until we can recalculate for slip space. Selene, eyes alight with suppressed fury, spoke calmly. I'll handle it. Just buy me a few minutes outside the hull. What? Outside? Crispin's blood ran cold. She inclined her head. I'm not defenseless, Crispin. Now that two swords are gone, I can access more of my own, shall we say, innate gifts. I've survived 1,000 battles. My skill was legendary long before these curses bound me. Her golden eyes flicked to Rawl. If your ship has an external platform, I can face them. They'll hesitate to fire if they see me floating unprotected in the void. Nobody wants to destroy the final sword. That might give us time to finish the slip space calculations. Crispin opened his mouth to protest, but Rawl intervened. Lady Aurelie, it's too dangerous. The final sword still weakens you. She shook her head. This is the best way. If we remain cowering inside, Mavericks will commence a barrage the moment they realize we're stalling. Let me distract them. I can do it without killing, if that's your concern. Thunderstruck at her resolve, Crispin pressed his lips together. He remembered her raw strength in the temple when she first arrived at his shop. Her fluid movements, even with two swords jammed in her body. Without them, she was likely formidable beyond reason. All right, he said softly, but don't you dare get yourself captured. A fierce spark lit her golden gaze. They can't capture me again, she promised. Not this time. Minutes later, Crispin and Captain Thena stood in the portside airlock, watching as Selene donned a thin exosuit that hugged her physique, but left the final sword accessible. She refused a helmet, citing her ability to survive short exposures to vacuum, thanks to centuries of mystical energies bonding with her physiology. Temple technicians fixed a harness over the sword's hilt to prevent accidental jostling. Crispin's heart hammered. Never seen someone do anything like this, he said, voice dry, walking into the void with half a sword lodged in them. Selene's lips curved in a wry smile. It's not exactly a universal pastime. She tested the exosuit's seals. If something goes wrong, promise me you'll still get that sword out of me somehow. I promise, Crispin said, though his throat felt tight. An alarm chimed as Thena signaled to the temple staff. The airlock's inner doors slid shut, and Selene stepped into the small chamber. Through a transparent viewport, Crispin watched her stand tall, despite obvious discomfort from the blade. When the outer doors hissed open, she launched herself into space with a practiced push, drifting toward Mavericks cruisers. On the tactical display inside the airlock, Crispin could see about Selene's life signs. She floated in the vacuum, a radiant figure haloed by the station's distant star, with the Dawnstalker behind her. The comm channel buzzed softly with static. Crispin heard Director Clen's startled exclamation. "What? Is she suicidal?" A sly grin tugged at Crispin's mouth. They don't realize who they're dealing with. Suddenly, an alarm shrilled on the main console. Thena's voice came over the ship-wide speakers. "Selene's begun an active energy emission. Sensors show she's generating a field. We're reading trans-spatial flux. Crispin, I think she's somehow tapping into the residual energies from the first two swords you removed." The sensor feed confirmed it. Selene's silhouette flared with arcs of shimmering violet light. Crispin couldn't have explained it scientifically, but he recognized the same cosmic potency he'd glimpsed each time he'd freed a blade. Only now it was Selene wielding it, funneling that might outward instead of letting it devour her from within. A burst of silver light streamed from her open palm, coalescing into a massive shimmering barrier that extended hundreds of meters. The Mavericks cruisers, which had started to advance, halted in confusion. Clen's voice crackled. "Hold position. All units, what in blazes is she doing?" Selene swung her arm in a graceful arc, and the barrier tilted, forming a protective wedge in front of the Dawnstalker. From the cruiser's vantage, it must have looked like a translucent shield, thick as a fortress wall. Crispin felt a surge of awe at the sight. Even with the last sword still embedded, Selene was capable of pushing back a small fleet without firing a single shot. "That's my signal to recalculate the slip space jump," Thena announced from the bridge. "We need at least 10 minutes. Crispin, can you handle the console inputs here in the airlock? Any maintenance or field overrides that might come up?" He glanced at the readouts around him. "I'll do what I can." He wasn't a pilot, but he could follow instructions. And if it helped Selene keep that barrier stable, he'd type commands until his fingers bled. Outside, a flicker of green erupted as a smaller Mavericks escort fired a testing shot at the shimmering field. The projectile dissolved instantly, sending a shockwave across the barrier's surface. Selene, floating behind it, didn't even flinch. Crispin imagined her exerting focus on a scale that would tear a normal person apart. Clennan's voice came again, more agitated. "She's alone! Focus fire! Overwhelm that barrier!" A volley of glowing energy bolts rained down on Selene's shield. Crispin gasped as the blast hammered the shimmering wall. Selene faltered for a split second. Her life signs spiked on the console, but she maintained control, fueling the barrier from her own wellspring of cosmic strength. "We're at 6 minutes for jump readiness," Thena urged. "She can't keep this up forever." Crispin clenched his jaw. "Then let's hope 6 minutes is enough." He began tapping frantically at an auxiliary interface, rerouting additional power to the Dawnstalker's slipspace drives. Every so often, he glanced at Selene's readouts, silently willing her to hold on just a little longer. Another wave of artillery fire rippled across Selene's barrier, forming spiderweb cracks of luminescent fractures. Crispin's anxiety soared. The console indicated her heart rate was dangerously high. Through the viewport, he could see her trembling form, arms held out in front of her as she sustained the wall of cosmic energy. Every so often, the final sword in her chest gave a violent pulse, as if eager to devour or redirect the power she channeled. 4 minutes, Thena called out. "They're bringing their primary cannons online, some kind of particle beam aimed right at the barrier." Selene's voice came through Crispin's headset, faint but resolute. "I can stop. Maybe one more big hit." She paused, breath ragged. Then I'll be too depleted. Let me know the moment you can jump. Crispin's hands flew over the controls, guided by Thena's calm instructions over the comm. Rerouting power to the slip space core, stabilizing the field emitters, he did everything he could. But the readouts showed they still needed more time for the drive's hypercoil to reach safe ignition levels. Suddenly, the Maverick's flagship unleashed a lance of searing emerald light. Crispin's eyes widened as he watched it collide with Selene's shield, penetrating deeper than any previous volley. The barrier bent inward, fracturing into a chaotic swirl. Selene let out a strangled cry. He saw her reeling, the vacuum around her rippling with residual energy. Alarms blared on the Dawnstalker. One of the temple healers rushed into the airlock chamber, shouting that Selene's vitals were spiking uncontrollably. Crispin's gut churned. She couldn't keep this up. If she collapsed, Mavericks wouldn't hesitate to advance and board the ship. They'd seize her. In the final sword, he did the only thing he could think of, sprinting to the manual override panel. Crispin popped it open and rerouted emergency power from non-essential life support zones. Lights flickered in the corridors. The heat in the airlock dropped, and Crispin could see his breath mist for a second. He hammered the last key. "Thena, try it now." On the bridge, the engines whined to a higher pitch. "We're at 98%. 30 seconds, Crispin," Thena shouted. The external cameras showed Selene's shield failing, bits of luminous shards floating away into space. Another projectile from Maverick soared in, blazing a lethal path. Crispin's heart pounded as he watched Selene's slumped figure brace for the impact, blood trailing from her mouth in the vacuum. Then, just as the projectile struck, a fresh wave of energy exploded from her. The barrier solidified again, if only for a heartbeat. The shot ricocheted off, exploding harmlessly in open space. A wave of dizzy relief swept Crispin. She was still alive, still holding on. Through the swirling afterglow, Crispin saw Selene's exhausted face. The final sword's glow pulsed ominously, but it hadn't overtaken her yet. A beep on the console signaled the slip space drive's readiness. Captain Thena's triumphant shout blared from the intercom. "Jump sequence engaged! Crispin, get her back inside, now!" He didn't need further prompting. Punching in a rapid sequence, Crispin triggered a tether beam that latched onto Selene's exosuit. It reeled her in like a lifeline. The moment she was back in the airlock, the outer doors slammed shut, and the Dawnstalker surged into slip space. Maverick's cruisers disappeared from view, outmaneuvered by Selene's last-ditch stand. When the Dawnstalker safely re-entered the swirling vortex of slip space, Crispin rushed into the airlock chamber just as the pressurization cycle completed. A swirl of cold air blasted him in the face as Selene stumbled forward, half collapsing into his arms. She coughed violently, flecks of dark blood staining her lips, and the final sword in her chest sparked menacingly. "Selene!" he cried, lowering her gently to the deck. Temple healers scrambled to assist. One checked her pulse, another tried to stabilize her with portable scanners that glowed a pale blue. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing slitted pupils like a wounded lioness. For a moment, Crispin thought she'd black out, but she clung to consciousness. We made it," she gasped. He managed a shaky smile, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "Yes, you did it. We jumped. Mavericks is behind us, at least for now." Outside the thick airlock windows, slip space twisted in kaleidoscopic patterns. This final jump would bring them to the fallen spiral, the star cluster's graveyard. The intercom crackled, and Thena's voice filtered through. "We'll arrive in 3 hours. If Mavericks attempts pursuit, it won't be immediate. We've scrambled our trail as best we can." The healers carefully eased Selene onto a stretcher. Crispin followed them to the infirmary, heart hammering with leftover adrenaline. Once inside, they placed Selene in a diagnostic cradle. "We need to purge her system of excess radiation," one healer murmured, scanning her with a wand that emitted a gentle hum. "She absorbed too much external fire." Selene's labored breath slowed, and she steadied under their ministrations. A temple guard rushed in, informing Crispin that Patriarch Rawl and the council elders wished to meet him in the near corridor. Reluctant to leave Selene, Crispin lingered a moment, brushing damp silver strands off her forehead. Her eyes opened a crack, and she managed a faint smile. "Go," she whispered. "I'll be all right." Nodding, Crispin followed the guard into a narrow hallway. There the elders waited, their expressions etched with both admiration and concern. "She truly is a formidable warrior," Maury said softly, admiration flickering in her wise old eyes. "Yet the final sword drains her as well as you. Time is of the essence." Elder Calaro nodded. "We arrive at the fallen spiral soon. If the sword's illusions are as potent as we fear, you must keep your wits about you. Are you prepared?" Crispin let out a long breath. He recalled the medallion they'd given him, the vessel's shield, which now hung around his neck. "I'm as ready as I can be, but I'm scared." A small, understanding smile tugged at Maury's lips. "Courage does not mean the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. Your compassion, Crispin, has seen you through so far. Let it guide you again." He swallowed, looking away. "I'll do my best. We have to succeed. I won't let Selene suffer anymore." Calaro bowed his head. "We will perform an invocation to fortify you before the final removal. These rites are older than the temple, gleaned from fragments of texts we believe predate most known civilizations. But the success depends on your own uncorrupted nature." Crispin thought about all the times he just wanted to help people with his cooking, the stumbles and small triumphs in his everyday life, the quiet joy of seeing a customer's face light up after tasting something new. If the final sword tried to tempt him with cosmic dominion, would he be strong enough to say no? The doubt gnawed at him, yet his resolve overshadowed it. He had to be. "Tell me what to do," he finally said, voice trembling, yet firm. "Tell me how to keep that blade from wrecking the universe and from hurting Selene anymore." Elder Maury extended her arm, gesturing for him to follow. "Come, we'll begin the ceremony in the Sanctum of Light. Captain Thena has adjusted the gravity well so we can practice the rites in slip space. By the time we emerge at the fallen spiral, your spirit will be girded against the blade's illusions." As Crispin walked beside the elders, the corridors flickering past in subdued lighting, he couldn't help reflecting on how drastically his life had changed in the last few days. A humble spice merchant, thrust into the role of cosmic sword liberator, facing down corporate fleets and ancient curses. And yet, beneath the strain, he felt a thread of hope. If he could free Selene from her final blade, maybe they'd both find a life free of burdens at last. The Sanctum of Light turned out to be a large, circular chamber near the center of the ship, lined with swirling tapestries. Tiny crystals embedded in the walls emitted a gentle glow, creating patterns reminiscent of stars. The council elders guided Crispin to a low, raised dais. He knelt on a plush cushion at its center, while they arranged themselves in a ring around him. "This invocation will weave protective layers around your consciousness," Elder Calaro explained. "Think of it as a barrier against the illusions the marrow of dominion might conjure. It will not grant you raw power, but it can shield your mind from subtle manipulations." Crispin nodded, swallowing hard. A part of him felt like an imposter, kneeling in a mystical rite he never sought. Another part remembered the chilling illusions inflicted by the second sword, how it had dredged up old insecurities until he nearly lost himself. If the final blade was worse, he'd need every advantage he could get. Soft chanting began, the elders harmonizing in a language Crispin didn't recognize. A resonance filled the air, making the crystals in the walls throb like beating hearts. Light curled through the space, forming filaments of luminescence that spun around Crispin. He shut his eyes, focusing on the slow rhythm of his breathing. A gentle warmth radiated from the medallion around his neck, like hands pressed soothingly against his chest. Vague sensations of peace, acceptance, and unity trickled into his mind. For a moment, Crispin's racing thoughts settled. He felt as though he were back in his shop, stirring a simple pot of tea, lulled by the comfort of routine. Then, without warning, an image flickered across his closed eyelids. Selene writhing in agony, the final sword blazing with vile power, spitting arcs of destructive light. Crispin clenched his teeth, forcing the vision away. Another image surfaced. Selene standing triumphant, with Crispin at her side. The two of them forging a golden empire of stars. The illusions teased at his sense of responsibility. urging him to consider how much good he could do if he embraced that power. Breathing raggedly, Crispin forced himself to recall who he was, a merchant who found joy in small kindnesses, not a galactic ruler. Gradually, the illusions receded, replaced by the calm weaving of the Elder's invocation. The luminous filaments encasing him pulsed, forging intangible bonds across his psyche. After an indeterminate time, minutes, or maybe hours, the chanting ceased. Crispin opened his eyes to see the elders gazing at him with a mixture of relief and admiration. A faint shimmer lingered in the air around him, as though he wore a translucent mantle of starry light. Mari inclined her head. "The invocation is complete. Your spirit is fortified, Crispin Bailey. When you face the blade's final snare, remember the peace you felt here." Slowly rising from the dais, Crispin let out a breath, half dazed. He felt steadier, yet every nerve buzzed with the awareness that these spells were only half of his defense. The other half lay in his own steadfast refusal to exploit power for selfish ends. A polite cough drew their attention. Captain Thena stood at the threshold, her silver hair catching the sanctum's glow. "We'll be arriving in the Fallen of Spiral soon," she said. "I'd appreciate it if everyone strapped in. The gravitational anomalies might cause turbulence. We'll find a safe vantage point to conduct whatever is needed." Crispin glanced at Rawl and the elders. "I guess this is it. Let's help Selene, and may luck be on our side." The Fallen Spiral was like a cosmic graveyard for stars. As the Dawnstalker dropped out of slipspace, Crispin peered through the main viewport. Here, space was dark in a way he'd never experienced. Pockets of swirling black matter and swirling stardust replaced the usual gleam of celestial bodies. Fragments of once mighty suns drifted like haunted debris, illuminated only by faint flickers of electromagnetic discharge. "This region is nearly void of life," Captain Thena explained, guiding the ship with a careful hand. "Gravity storms can appear without warning. If something goes awry, any shockwave from the sword's release should dissipate among these dead stars." Patriarch Rawl and the council elders clustered on the bridge, quietly chanting protective prayers. Crispin stood behind them, a cold sweat prickling his skin. He spotted Selene in the corner, leaning on a temple guard for support. She still looked pale, but she nodded firmly when she met Crispin's eyes. "We do it now," she said. "No more waiting. The sooner the sword is gone, the better." Thena swiveled in her seat. "I'll position us near that cluster of inert solar wreckage." She pointed at a region on the holographic display. "It's stable enough for a controlled spacewalk or docking maneuver." "The elders told me the unbinding must happen outside the ship." Rawl nodded gravely. "Yes. The final sword's discharge might unravel local reality. We can't risk the Dawnstalker's hull. We'll set down on one of the largest fragments. There's enough gravity to stand, albeit lightly. Crispin and Selene can perform the removal with the temple's wards established around them." Selene took a shaky step forward. "I'm going, obviously." "Crispin, you've come this far. Only you can extract it." She paused, glancing down at her chest. "But if you sense anything is going wrong, any sign you're losing yourself, you must stop." He nodded, heart pounding. "Understood. Let's just hope I don't get any power-hungry ideas in the middle of it." A strange hush settled as the Dawnstalker executed a gentle landing on the rocky surface of a star fragment. Outside the windows, Crispin could see jagged shards of obsidian-like rock dotted with traces of ancient cosmic residue. There was a dim glow from swirling cosmic dust overhead, but otherwise the place was draped in quiet darkness. The perfect stage for a final confrontation with an ancient curse. Once the landing gear locked, Crispin and Selene, along with Patriarch Rawl and a few guards, geared up in environment suits. This time, Selene acquiesced to wearing a full helmet. Her ordeal in vacuum earlier was too recent, and she still bore the scars of that effort. Crispin felt a pang of worry. She was in no condition for battle. But then, this was the only way to end her suffering forever. They stepped onto the broken star fragment, their boots crunching on brittle terrain. Crispin's suit displayed minimal atmosphere outside, near absolute silence except for the faint whir of electronics. The temple guard circled around them, placing crystal pylons that glowed faintly, forming a wide protective perimeter. Meanwhile, Rawl carefully recited an incantation. each syllable shimmering in the vacuum like ghostly runes. At the center stood Crispin and Selene. The final sword jutted from her chest, a black hilt with veins of red that pulsed like a living organ. Crispin's breath echoed loudly in his helmet. He recalled the warnings, steeling himself against illusions or seductive whispers. Yet when he reached out and touched the sword's hilt, he heard nothing but a faint thrum, like a heartbeat out of sync with the universe. "Ready?" Selene asked, voice crackling through the suit's comm. Crispin tightened his grip on the hilt. "As I'll ever be." In the distance, Captain Thena's voice crackled from the Dawnstalker's external speakers. "We're monitoring your vitals. Don't rush. The temple wards are in place." Slowly, Crispin pulled. Unlike the first two swords, this one resisted from the start. He felt a force pushing back, as if the sword had anchored itself to Selene's very soul. She let out a pained cry, her suit's sensors spiking. Crispin halted, trembling. A swirl of dark energy seeped from the sword's edges, coiling like black tendrils around Selene's torso. Her entire body jolted, and Crispin saw her face contort in agony through the suit's visor. The temple wards flared, the crystal pylons vibrating as they intercepted the blade's negative energies. An alarm beeped in Crispin's helmet, tracking both Selene's and his own rising stress levels. "Keep going," Selene gasped, her voice ragged. "Don't stop. Just get it out." But Crispin could sense the sword's presence in his mind, a faint whisper building into a symphony. It offered a vision. Crispin standing tall amid swirling constellations, remaking them with each stroke of a ladle, almost mockingly referencing his cooking hobby. In this vision, entire star systems blossomed like gourmet dishes under his control. People thrived, wars ceased, all under Crispin's benevolent watch. "You can fix everything," the blade seemed to promise. "Never let suffering remain. You, Crispin Bailey, can become the caretaker of a perfect universe." His grip faltered. He felt tears leak down his cheeks inside the helmet. The idea of a galaxy without suffering, without pain for anyone, was heartbreakingly tempting. After all, he'd dedicated his small life to healing minor ailments with teas and spices. What if he could heal the entire cosmos? No, a flicker of reality cut through the illusions. Crispin recalled the comedic misunderstandings that led him here, how he'd never intended to become a cosmic figure. He remembered Selene's anguish, the burden she carried. Ruling the universe would only perpetuate a new form of control, and wasn't the final sword known for enslaving the bearer? Crispin refused to become the next prison keeper. Gritting his teeth, he pulled again. The illusions wavered, replaced by a violent surge of black and red sparks that rained over them both. Selene's scream tore through the comm. The ground quaked underfoot, cracked spider-webbing across the star fragment's surface as the sword unleashed its fury. The protective pylons glowed, struggling to contain the monstrous release of energy. A savage tremor knocked Crispin backward, but he refused to let go of the sword. Inside his mind, the illusions returned in a fevered rush. The promise of cosmic dominion, of rewriting reality to eradicate hardship. Crispin recognized how seductive it was, but also how ephemeral. Absolute power corrupts, no matter how well-intentioned. He clung to the memory of his humble shop. The simple act of handing a sick traveler a healing tea, the joy of small, meaningful gestures. Drawing on the newfound mental shield from the Elder's invocation, Crispin roared with effort, yanking the sword free in one decisive motion. For a split second, everything went silent, a vacuum hush enveloping their suits. Then, a burst of blinding light exploded from Selene's chest, and Crispin felt himself hurled backward by a force that defied comprehension. He slammed onto the rocky surface, the breath knocked from his lungs. Stars danced in his vision. A massive wave of energy roiled outwards, colliding with the temple wards. Crispin thought he heard the pylons shatter one by one, their crystals shrieking as they absorbed the final blade's cataclysmic outpouring. Time stretched in an agonizing instant. Crispin fought to keep his eyes open. He saw Selene half floating, freed from the sword, violet blood spilling from her suit's chest panel. Then an implosion of black light drew all that destructive energy inward. The star fragment's horizon warped, as if the universe inhaled a breath and held it. When the shockwave finally dissipated, Crispin realized he was still clutching the marrow of dominion. The blade, wreathed in swirling darkness, vibrated with unbelievable tension, as if it might rend the cosmos at any moment. Crispin's entire body felt like it had been filleted. Pain throbbed in his limbs, in his head, in his soul. Yet, as he fought to remain conscious, he heard a faint voice in his helmet calm. Crispin, Crispin, do you read? Blinking to clear his blurred vision, he spotted Selene collapsed a few meters away. Her suit's life support was flickering dangerously, her violet skin pale. A part of Crispin howled inside. She couldn't die now, not after all this. Summoning every ounce of will, he crawled across the debris-strewn surface, the final sword still clutched in one trembling fist. Temple guards were nowhere to be seen. Some had likely been thrown clear of the circle. Crispin glimpsed vague shapes scrambling at the perimeter. Through the dust-choked air, he could just make out the silhouette of the Dawnstalker, battered but intact. Selene, he croaked. Hold on. She gazed at him with hazy eyes, her breath ragged. Is it done? She managed. He nodded, holding up the sword. Its once pulsing veins of red seemed to be consuming themselves, dark streaks flickering erratically. It's out, he rasped. We just have to neutralize it somehow. A surge of black lightning danced along the blade, lashing Crispin's gauntlet. He grit his teeth, nearly passing out from the pain. The illusions pounded at the edges of his psyche again, promising unlimited might. The newly established wards in Crispin's mind wavered. Another wave of seduction. Use it now. Heal her. Heal them all. End all pain. You can do it if you yield to me. His heart twisted. He'd give anything to save Selene, to remove her torment forever. But no, this cursed power would only create a new chain of enslavement. He remembered the second sword's illusions, how they fed on despair. The marrow of dominion fed on hope, the desire to fix everything. He refused to let it in. The Dawnstalker's hatch whirred open, and Captain Thena appeared in a suit, flanked by a pair of temple guards, bracing portable wards. Patriarch Rahl stumbled out behind them, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. Crispin! Rahl shouted, voice trembling with desperation. Drop the sword. We'll seal it in a stasis field. Crispin cradled Selene's head against his chest, searching her visor for signs of consciousness. Her eyes drifted shut, breathing shallow. She needs help. But if Crispin relinquished the sword to Rahl, the moment it left Crispin's innocent hands, it might lash out uncontrollably, or bond with someone else. A swirl of panic threatened to overtake him. You can save her now, the sword whispered, more clearly than ever. Claim my power, rewrite her wounds, rewrite the cosmos. His eyes squeezed shut. The moment he admitted that desire, Crispin felt the blade's influence seeping into his limbs. A swirl of cosmic awareness brushed his mind, an ephemeral taste of what it meant to shape matter on a whim. He saw stars trembling in the dark, awaiting his command. He saw Selene, healthy and free of scars, smiling at him on a perfect world. A tear slipped down his cheek. No, he choked. I refuse. Mustering the last shred of will, Crispin tore the medallion from his suit's collar. He pressed it against the sword's hilt, forcing all that swirling darkness into contact with the vessel's shield. A brilliant flash exploded, overshadowing the dead star's gloom. Crispin felt his mind teeter on oblivion as energies collided. The medallion's protective harmony warred with the sword's infinite hunger. For a heartbeat, Crispin glimpsed a new illusion. A vast kitchen spanning galaxies, with every star a simmering pot. He could taste universal harmony if he just let go. Then the image shattered. The swirl of black lightning imploded, sucked into the medallion's glimmer like water down a drain. The sword went limp, metal dull as lead. Crispin's suit readouts flickered wildly, and he collapsed. The medallion fused to the blade in a molten circle of star metal. From my personal perspective, Crispin's journey reminds me that heroism isn't about might or grand titles, but about caring for others in small, meaningful ways. He didn't crave power or glory, he simply wanted to save a life, and ended up unbinding a curse that spanned millennia. Along the way, we saw armies clash, cosmic secrets unravel, and an eternal warrior finally find peace. In the end, Crispin's humility and empathy triumphed over greed and ambition. Selene's freedom is a testament to the idea that compassion and courage can triumph when everything else seems lost. And while starships and prophecies added drama, it was that quiet determination, the resolve to do right by someone, that truly changed the universe. Now that you've reached the conclusion, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below to share your favorite moments, speculate on what happens next, and join the discussion. Thank you for listening, and keep the adventure alive.